tech as it plays out in surveillance is, of course, on the rise. And so the spy plane, something that if you're my age or older was something out of the Bond or the Matt Helm movie when we were kids, that is a day-to-day thing in Baltimore life. Ain't that some shit? We're going to get all into that this evening. Benjamin H. Snyder is Associate Professor of Sociology at Williams College, the author of The Disrupted Workplace, Time and the Moral Order of Flexible Capitalism. So glad to have him here. So glad to be joined by Red Emma's fan, Brandon Soderberg, who is a reporter on guns, drugs, police, corruption, and the co-author of I Got a Monster, The Rise and Fall of America's Most Corrupt Police Squad. Formerly the editor-in-chief of the City Paper, has worked for The Intercept, Vice, The Appeal, so many things you are familiar with, and we're going to get right into this thing. Spy plane. Inside Baltimore surveillance experiment. In a few minutes, you will see me out here with the book. You can slip over at any time to pick it up. If you are paying with card, if you are paying with cash, we'll take care of that in the bookstore. I need you to make some real radical roof-raising Red Emma's noise for In Conversation with Brandon Soderberg, Benjamin H. Snyder.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Ben's going to start by reading from the book, which I'm really excited to sort of, you all get to hear the book, because it's a really compelling and entertaining story as well as the deep research he did. So go for it, Ben.
Thanks, Brandon. This is a real thrill for me to sit here and read this to you, so I'm just going to soak it in for a second. This is from Chapter 2, The All-Seeing Eye. Seeing a murder with the spy plane, at least when you get a good case, is like time travel. It's like being handed a mystery novel open to the middle chapters. You know that the whole story is there in the book, already written down, but you're not sure how you got to the particular page you were given, and you're not sure what happens at the end. So you have two tasks. One, go back to an earlier part and work your way through to the moment of the crime. And two, to push your way forward to the end of the story, hopefully finding out who the killer is along the way. Outside the story, in real life, time marches on like normal. The case gets older and older, colder and colder. Thank you. As investigators push forward with what they have, or decide to drop the case. But inside the story, everything is frozen in time. As you become more familiar with a case, you can move around more freely in the world of the story, back and forth in time, revisiting key parts, and gleaning even more meaning from earlier bits because you already know what happens in the end. The murder is always there, preserved. Around 3 in the afternoon one summer day, 2 detectives are let in through the password-protected door to the Spy Plane Operations Center. Occupying half a floor of a large office building in downtown Baltimore, the center is what you might imagine from a television crime drama, filled with gigantic screens and people looking intently at images and paperwork about crime. A few months earlier, when the head of the company, Ross McNutt, was showing me around the place as it was being constructed, he said he wanted the detectives to be impressed with what they saw, so he put up as many screens as he could possibly fit in the room. There are an almost comical number of screens. Gigantic monitors sit in front of each member of the team he hired, consisting of 20 analysts and 5 supervisors, arranged evenly in 4 rows of long desks. These 50-inch screens allow them to look closely at the pixelated images from the spy plane cameras. As the 2 planes fly above the city in adjacent circles, each equipped with a wide area motion imagery unit, known as WAMI, they capture one massive image of 30 square miles of the city each second. Click, click, click. The images aren't perfect. A car looks like a little tic-tac, and a person like a little dot or smudge. But the resolution is just enough for a sharp-eyed analyst to follow people and cars on the ground. Using iView, the company's proprietary image processing and markup software, each image is rendered in seconds, mapped onto its corresponding latitude and longitude on the Earth, and tagged with a precise timestamp. The result, an almost perfectly preserved visual record of the second-by-second movements of almost the entire city in both time and space. The software allows analysts to zoom in on smaller sections of the city and make tracking marks using colored circles and lines. Again, the zoom isn't perfect. They can't go from a city-size view to looking at your face, but vehicles that are completely undetectable to the naked eye at the image's widest view become just clear enough to see and tag when you zoom in. The gigantic monitors then are key to giving analysts a fighting chance of actually picking out a tiny person walking on the street and following them each time the fuzzy, jumpy imagery refreshes. Up on the walls, televisions are hung displaying weather, news feeds, Fox News on one side, CNN on the other, and other information from ongoing investigations. These screens are almost never used by the analysts as far as I can tell, but they give the room a certain Hollywood situation room feel. Though it's scorching outside, it's July. The air conditioning is blasting to keep all these devices cool, so everyone's wearing an extra layer. I recognize detectives Franks and O'Reilly as they come through the door, two young and ambitious homicide detectives who are part of a squad that has made ample use of the spy plane. Earlier in the day, O'Reilly called in to say that a homicide had happened around 12:30 p.m. on the west side of the city, and to get the imagery ready because they'd be coming to see the footage as soon as they were done canvassing the scene. By the time the detectives arrived, Jessica, the program's head analyst supervisor, had the imagery ready to go. Jessica has Franks and O'Reilly crowd around her terminal to take a look at the imagery on iView. They tell her the exact time of the murder, 12:47 p.m., and the exact address of the incident, a carry-out convenience store on Carroll Avenue in a residential neighborhood of West Baltimore. That's not the real name of the street, by the way. The investigation would thus become known as the Carroll Avenue case, since police refer to homicides by the street name rather than the people involved. Jessica uses some software tools to pull the time back on the imagery and zoom in toward the address. It's in coverage, she tells the detectives. Zooming down some more, she adds, and it's looking really clear, right in the middle, right in the center. There is a basic procedure to a spy plane investigation, and several questions come up early on that can tell you whether the case will be good from the start. In this instance, unlike many of the cases the program received, many variables have lined up to make the Carroll Avenue imagery particularly good. The first is that the plane was actually in the sky during the incident. It's often down because of rain, low clouds, or darkness. But beyond this basic issue, there's also many factors that contribute to the quality of the imagery, making it suitable to actually see the incident in question and track accurately. In this case, the plane had been in the air all day that day and would continue through to sunset, allowing analysts to go far back and forth in time. Nothing's more frustrating than when the plane captures just a few minutes of a crime before it lands, say, to refuel. The incident is also located close to the center of the plane's orbit, where the imagery is the crispest. Cases on the edges of the image can be hard to work because the footage is blurry. And finally, the footage is taken from an altitude of around 7,000 feet. Unlike what you would expect, the lower the plane flies, the worse the imagery is for tracking. When the plane is pushed to low altitudes by cloud cover, for example, the cameras create a more angled view of the ground rather than a top-down view, which makes tall buildings and trees appear to stick out more. These can easily obstruct an analyst's view as she tracks. A line of trees or tall buildings can appear to lean over and completely obscure an entire road sometimes. This time, the imagery's perfect. The detectives look at each other approvingly. They've been burned by these kinds of complications before, and given that the murder is only a few hours old, they're able to do more with the plane than just document what happened or open up a few leads. They might actually be able to find out where the suspect is currently located and make a quick arrest. That would certainly, quote-unquote, send a message that police are watching. Jessica zooms in so that the carryout and its adjacent streets and buildings fill the whole of her monitor. And this is the imagery you're seeing above me right now. She moves her head closer to the screen. Franks and O'Reilly lean in too. She starts quickly clicking through the imagery from 12:46 onward. Each click of her mouse serving up the next second of recorded motion. At around 12:48, she sees a group of tiny dots moving rapidly in different directions out of what is probably the entrance of the carryout. There, she says. Yep, says Detective Franks. That's it. Here are all the witnesses fleeing. Frank says that they already pulled the security camera footage from inside the carryout, and noted that there were about 7 or 8 people inside who fled the store right after the suspect had walked in and shot someone. Franks and O'Reilly pay almost no attention to the witnesses. I assume this is because they know none of them will talk about what they saw. The detectives tell Jessica that in the security camera footage, the suspect runs out before the witnesses do. Jessica pulls the imagery back in time and again starts moving through it frame by frame, now with an eye more attuned to where the carry-out entrance is. She suddenly notices another dot exit the store very quickly, a few seconds before the larger group. She had missed this detail the first time. Pointing out the dot, she remarks, "Whoa, look at this guy." "Yep," Franks agrees. "That's what we saw in the security camera footage. A guy runs out." With Jessica having identified the basic crime scene and some suspicious movement, the spy plane imagery is now able to start revealing more of the story. Jessica points to the little dot that is presumably the suspect fleeing the scene. With her finger a few inches from the screen, guiding onlookers' eyes, Jessica helps us watch the little dot of a person move at very high speed to the left, around some sort of obstruction, maybe a fence, into an alleyway just behind the store, and up to a dark-colored vehicle that's parked in the alley. The dot disappears, one presumes, inside the vehicle. 2 or 3 seconds later, the vehicle begins to move at high speed down the alley and through the neighborhood, heading southwest and then circling back eastward toward a large and busy intersection. Before the car has to stop with the traffic piling up at the intersection, presumably it's a red light, it makes a series of wild shortcuts southbound through a parking lot, into an adjacent parking lot, and out onto a busy road, doubling back and now heading northbound. He's avoiding that stoplight, Jessica surmises. She centers the imagery on the parking lot and clicks on a button on iView called Google Earth. The software automatically loads a Google satellite image in a new window queued to the exact same location of the parking lot displayed on the iView screen. O'Reilly says, "Oh yeah, we know that place. It has really good cameras, so we can pull that." Franks writes down the exact time recorded on the spy plane footage of when the vehicle goes through the parking lot. That way, when he visits the gas station later, he doesn't have to spend hours looking through the entire day's security camera footage to find the vehicle he needs. Everyone steps back from the screen. The detectives, looking satisfied, tell Jessica that they'll head over to the gas station now and get in touch if they need more. She says her team will get to work on the case. The detectives leave. Jessica looks at me with raised eyebrows. "That was nice," she says. This is already a good result. Without the plane, the detectives would never have known to look at that specific gas station. And even if they did, they would not have known the exact time period to pull up in the station's video logs. A case that could have easily gone cold is now red hot.
Yeah, so that's sort of the plane in action in the most sort of neutral way, right? So Ben's going to show some footage and kind of narrate it for a second here and kind of give you a sense of what you see, and then we'll start talking. So you get kind of a full sense of the reality is this footage and what ultimately happens in cases like this.
So yeah, what I just read is this imagery, and of course the frustration of writing a book about video is that you can't show the video. So this is actually a great pleasure for me to be able to show this to you. So this, where my mouse is the carryout. So I'm going to play it through once without comment, and then I'll go back and point out a few things. And it's just a short clip, 24 seconds. That's it. The highest of high tech, right?
Yeah, so what are we looking at?
So let me zoom back. So the way I told it in the book is the part that they actually see initially is the witnesses fleeing the carryout. So let me just show you what that looks like. It's happening now. And I'm going to move it back and forth. And I want you to just look at the carryout building. Do you see anything? Little flickers, little flicks. tiny little dots on the edge of this building. And so I'll put my mouse right now over a person right there. So I want you to focus on that little smudge of an object and just see what it's doing. You see? So that's a person. And spy plane analysts get very good at seeing that type of detail, that type of resolution. And they will all tell you when they first started, they couldn't see anything. And after a couple of months, they can see things. It starts to emerge at you. So what you'll see then is somebody running out after that time at a very high speed. And so they put this track mark over that person. But again, I want to go back to him running out. We actually know who the person is. Actually, the investigation yielded that. But do you see this little smudgy line, if you will? That is the shadow of the person on the ground, is actually a lot of what you can see. So what this yielded then was this suspect got into this vehicle in the alleyway and drove off. And then they had footage going all over the city. And what it eventually led to was they were able to track this person before the murder happened. So you don't typically have that kind of information, but they were able to track the suspect before the murder happened back to where he filled up his tires. And there's video cameras on tire pumps at gas stations, and they were able to pull a facial photo of the suspect. They then sent that to an FBI task force that had a facial recognition capability, and they were able to get a hit from that database, and then that eventually led to an arrest. So the spy plane in this case, quote unquote, worked. What's interesting, though, is that case eventually got thrown out. And it got thrown out like every single other case that the spy plane touched, because the spy plane was eventually deemed unconstitutional. So I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Maybe to go back, like, do you want to briefly explain how did you get interested in this story? Your role in it.
Yeah, so I'm a sociologist. I live in Massachusetts, so what the hell am I doing here? So my wife's family is three generations back Baltimore. My sister-in-law's here right now, actually. Hi, Bree. And so I've been, since I married my partner, kind of fallen in love with Baltimore, and I've loved coming to the city. So one day I'm listening to the Radio Lab podcast. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. They did 2 episodes on the spy plane. And so the spy plane came to Baltimore in 2016, as many of you will know, came under secret circumstances. And they did a couple of episodes about the spy plane, and I heard it was in Baltimore, and I thought, I need to know more about this. And so I literally emailed Ross McNutt saying, hi, I'm interested in your technology. Will you talk to me? And he said, sure. What do you want to know? So pretty soon we're on I think it was Skype at the time. Remember Skype? A Skype call. And he's showing me imagery and walking me through some of the cases that they had worked in Ciudad Juarez, which is one of the cities that they had worked in before they came to Baltimore. And so I got interested in that, and I said, Ross, if you ever get a chance to run this program in a bigger capacity, will you let me come observe? And this was in 2017. And he said, sure, I'll let you. Yeah, he's like, I want total transparency is what he would always say to me. So fast forward to 2020, the pandemic is crashing down upon us all, and the BPD decides to run the spy plane program again, kind of inexplicably. And again, I asked Ross McNutt, would you allow me to come be the person to just sort of watch what's going on? And he said, sure, I want total transparency. So in part because of the pandemic, I ended up being the only person not hired by the police or by Persistent Surveillance Systems, the company that ran the spy plane, who was there. So I was given the instructions to be a completely independent researcher, and I didn't take money from the company at any point. And they asked me to write the most accurate portrayal of what was going on as I could. So you can't ask for better circumstances as a sociologist. I was very lucky to just dumb luck find myself in that situation. And so now I feel this huge obligation to tell people in Baltimore what happened. So that's why I'm here.
Do you mind briefly explaining this is a curveball, sorry, it's your total academic freedom kind of contract, or whatever you call it?
Yeah, so when I first got into the Operations Center in 2020, the lawyer for persistent surveillance system was like, "What are you doing here?" And took me aside and said, "You can't look at anything." And I thought I was done for. I thought I was cooked. But I spent about half a day in his office trying to hash out some terms in which they would allow me to be there. And so the deal was, we're going to give you total academic freedom. It's written in a contract. And in exchange, you need to do some consulting for us at some point. So for example, if we want you to do a little mini study on some of the data from the program, just like write something up for us. So I thought, that's like, fine, I don't mind doing that. And I did that a couple of times, but for the most part, they just let me run wild. They gave me a key card. I could access the terminals and run through the raw footage myself, which I did many, many times. So I didn't have to rely on the reports of analysts. If they told me this is what they saw, I could go check. Is that what you saw? Is that what I see? And there were some pretty interesting things that came out of that.
And then, you've all now seen some of the footage. Ben and I did a story earlier this year about another case where it wasn't really disclosed. So there's a number of problems that the plane introduces. But I think that something that was really helpful, both in getting to know Ben and working with him, was the central concept of what you've called the boomer versus doomer concerns about surveillance. So I think that's a good way to ground us into the rest of this. Can you kind of explain what you mean by that, I guess?
Yeah, so I spend a lot of time talking about hype in the book. And so I came up with this phrase, the boomer doomer hype cycle, which is what I perceive to be this continual pattern that we use when any kind of cutting edge technology, surveillance or otherwise, comes into public discourse. So boomers are people who are usually interested in technology as a solution to intractable social problems. They think of technology as game-changing, that it can fix crime or something like that. You might hear them say things like that. And in my field, science and technology studies, we refer to these types of people as techno-solutionists. They're people who think we don't really need to fix the root causes of a problem. We can use technology to swoop in and solve what's going on. So with the spy plane, you certainly saw those types of voices come out, and even McNutt, who I would put in this camp, would say things like, the spy plane can quote unquote solve otherwise unsolvable crimes. That was the kind of tagline of the program. So what happens is when the boomers or boosters come in, closely behind them come the doomers. And the doomers will often say things like, we're heading toward a dystopian totalitarian state. Big Brother is watching. This is an incredible violation of all of our privacy. And typically, like with the spy plane, the way that sounded was, the spy plane is going to be like a police officer following you every time you walk outside your door. The spy plane is going to see things about you that are deeply private that only you know. And it's not true. The spy plane's not that powerful, actually. So it can't really solve otherwise unsolvable crimes very routinely. Occasionally it can. And it also cannot follow you every time you step outside your door, nor would the police be able to do that. Like they literally don't have the power to do that effectively. So what I noticed about boomers and doomers is that they're both playing into hype in a certain way. And they kind of both have as the basis of their analysis of the technology a kind of overblown, I guess, view of what technology can do. And what I notice is that these two camps kind of go back and forth, and then we never actually get to debate what the technology actually can do and what its harms actually are going to be. Like, okay, it can't follow me around all day long, but it can do some bad stuff, actually. And so in the boomer-doomer conversation, we never get to debate that concrete stuff. So it turns into this cycle where boomers and doomers kind of exhaust the conversation. We never really get to have a clear-headed debate about the technology. And usually what happens is the technology underperforms. It actually can't do what the boosters said it could do, and the doomers are kind of less worried now. And then we just move on to the next thing. Rinse and repeat. So that's why it's a cycle. And I think part of my job with writing this book is to try to get us to debate technology in a different way. I would like us to do it in a different way. So.
Yeah, and this is kind of where, because the thing about the plane is the general idea of the plane, I think, is scary to all of us. We all lived in a city where it happened. You could hear it. You could kind of see it sometimes. And also, though, that a lot of where the rubber really hits the road, I think, with this thing being scary is in the micro details of what it can or cannot do and how it does that. Yeah. And central to that Ben really helped me better understand when we were reporting together, was the idea that the technology is always boosted in this way too, that omits the human element, right? And so I think that the easiest, I mean, I'll bring it up that, like, to me, the plane could be just as much as a machine that can find people guilty of crimes. My first thought when I learned about it was that it could also essentially be an exoneration machine. You said I'm on this corner, I shot this guy, well, follow me all around, I'll show you I'm not, which is also troubling. But it kind of can't do either. It kind of toggles between those. Also, additionally, there was a pitch briefly that it could catch dirty cops. I actually wrote about a case where a bunch of cops shot a guy, and then the footage was hidden for years. So that's what happens when that happens. But what is especially interesting about the technology used to investigate serious crimes, violent crimes, in particular murder, is these false positives. I think that's kind of central to the book, and that's the thing that, for me, for what it's worth, I had not really thought of in the way until you really see the technology. So you can kind of discuss the false positive concerns and maybe cite some examples that you witnessed.
Yeah, so a false positive in a policing technology is when the technology identifies someone as a suspect, or sometimes a place as a suspicious place, that actually has nothing to do with the crime. And all of the policing technologies that I've looked at, facial recognition, shot spotter, oh my God, we got that here. We got it up where I live as well. It's everywhere. Database surveillance, like this company Palantir uses. Every single one of those technologies has a false positive problem. And that is a concrete risk, actually, that we never get to debate in the boomer doomer thing. So in the case of the spy plane, I mean, this is maybe the most important piece of information I can convey to you. I witnessed one case in which the spy plane analysts mistakenly tracked someone and sent detectives to that person's apartment. Detectives were not able to find that person, and the spy plane analysts detected the mistake in time and called up the detective and said, back off. So no, I guess, real egregious harm came of that incident, but the reason why they mistracked the person is a technical reason. One of the things that happens with spy plane footage is as the plane is going around in a circle, tall things can lean over, is the best way I can put it. So you can picture that plane going around in a circle. It's looking in an angled direction at the city. So anything that is vertical to you in real life, to the spy plane looks like this. So what can happen is the buildings, as the plane goes around, will bend over in the imagery. It's bizarre. It's like surreal to watch. And that can block the view of the street. So if a spy plane analyst is tracking a car, that car might go behind a set of buildings and suddenly they lose track of it. And so what analysts have to do is prevent, and this is a technical term in spy plane analysis, prevent themselves from quote unquote jumping cars. So they're clicking with their mouse every frame on a particular vehicle, and they can accidentally click on the wrong vehicle and not notice it. And you can see how blurry the footage is. If a car is like light in color, well, there's tons of other light in color cars right around the car you're tracking, let's say. And I saw this happen quite a few times where an analyst would jump cars. So the hope is that you always notice when you've made that mistake, but they didn't catch it in this particular instance, and that actually led to potentially sending police. Well, they sent police into a black neighborhood on false pretenses. That's an extremely dangerous harm that wasn't discussed and debated. And so I think part of what I try to show in the book is that there were those types of harms all along the way that were never discussed or presented to you when the program was put out as a test.
Yeah, and I mean, and then kind of related to that too, there's that I guess what I really helped me to understand it was that these are just not things that I thought were the concern, and I think, and I guess I'm going to be a doomer for a second. I'm good at that, but is that okay? Imagine these police, and we know Baltimore police. Imagine they hadn't gotten that call. Imagine they looked in that guy's window or saw something, or they see, oh, that looks suspicious. It could be, again, it could be a joint, anything that might justify them entering the house. Those are all things that happen simply because an analyst in downtown who's been trained on the software missed one pixel. And I think that's just to me, that's, I think, really important to stress. And then another example, which this is a story that Ben and I did for Baltimore Magazine earlier this year, was an incident where the plane was used to justify the claim this man committed a murder. The footage that we saw, we're kind of showing that when we first walked in. It's by the mall, Mundum Mall. And in that incident, the car they're following goes under a bunch of trees. There's a lot of leafy areas around Mundalman, so he misses. I watched the footage. We had it, so I could watch it 100 times. I wasn't always convinced that it was the same car. And then another thing that happened in that footage that's slightly comedic is that at some point you want to explain the wheel of it's you'll get it better.
So the wheel of the plane occasionally pokes into the footage. Yeah, and there were, I want to say, a handful of occasions where an analyst would be presenting information to the detectives on a case, and they're tracking, and just at the moment where they really need to see where the car or person is going, in comes the wheel. It's almost comical. Here comes Wheelie, and they would be like, "Oh, the wheel." So, you would think this is a high-tech military gadget, cutting edge from the U.S. military. But actually, there's a lot of glitches and problems and malfunctions and all this stuff going on. And I could list to you several others. You see how the imagery is stitched together? So the actual unit is 12 cameras, and they're digitally stitched together using software. So the second plane, which they brought into Baltimore a little bit late, malfunctioned all the time. And that stitching would sometimes not line up just perfectly. And there would be these big black gaps in between the camera images. And that black gap could just cover over the thing you're tracking for a couple of frames, and you completely lose it. Right? So did you know that was going to happen? I didn't know that was going to happen. So there's just lots of stuff that if we could debate and get a real kind of honest accounting of what the thing can and cannot do, we might actually ask some pretty interesting questions about whether this thing is going to be effective. Is it going to be dangerous? Yeah.
Yeah, and then related to that a little bit too is that there was community engagement, but it was done in a very interesting way. And can you kind of just I think what I'm sort of looking at is some of these concerns, can the plane do what it says it can do? How should people respond to it? And also specifically this concern about reducing, either solving crimes or literally reducing crime or increasing safety and the perception of safety. Can you talk about that community element of it and how that all played out? And I guess I should say that was especially complicated because, as I'm sure most people know here, the plane flew in secret throughout 2016. So it flew completely without our knowledge until a Bloomberg Business story covered it in August 2016. And then the police were like, this isn't any different than any other camera. Shut up. It's not a problem. That was basically their argument. Right. And then they said, but we'll do better next time, which is what they always say. And so you kind of track can you discuss a little bit the 2020 community engagement? I'll put that in scare quotes.
Yeah. And so I started this project in 2017, but the plane didn't really fly again until 2020. So what was I doing in the interim? Well, I was following this effort that Ross McNutt and PSS made to get community buy-in. So they tried really, really hard to get a group of particularly West Baltimore citizens to become backers of the plane. And so the way he did that is he held, I think it's something like 47 community meetings. Many of them were held in churches in West Baltimore, community centers. Occasionally he would bring folks to the spy plane headquarters, which was downtown Baltimore. And he would pitch them the technology like he had pitched it to police, actually. And he had a very long slide deck where he would show them imagery and talk about how incredible the plane is and what it can do and how it can solve otherwise unsolvable crimes. So what he discovered in those many, many meetings is that there was this incredible interest in tracking police as well. And so citizens were told by McNutt that that's something that the program could do, that it could serve folks who have been falsely accused, for example. If we have spy plane footage of your case, your defense attorney can ask us for footage and we can use that to help exonerate you. And as Brandon is brilliantly reported, that did happen at least one time, though the story is quite complex, and I cover that story in the book as well. But what's interesting is, there were a lot of promises made about that capacity. It's called surveillance in the parlance of sociologists. It's watching from below, so community members being able to watch the state. That is something that the spy plane program promised it could do. And so come 2020 then, a lot of those community supporters were waiting for the surveillance program to get going too. So the surveillance program was going great. We're getting engagement with police. We're briefing the DA and how to do spy plane investigations in court. And a lot of community members who supported the plane are like, what about watching the police? Like, we're doing that, right? And that part of the program just really never materialized. So there were some hard feelings about that, actually. And there were other issues, I think, around employing local community members and things like that. But a lot of the public support for the plane came from McNutt really getting out there, and doing the work and really trying to get communities to almost have a conversion experience and see it as this utopian thing that he saw it to be.
Yeah, and I guess I'll chime in for a second. And what was particularly interesting about these demands that the plane be used to look at the cops is that it had, when I spoke to Ross, the founder, the creator of the plane in 2018, and this is in Ben's book a little bit, he told me, he's like, there's a police shooting we captured. And I was like, okay, tell me more about that. And he just kind of didn't. And I started digging around, and it took me almost a year, but I figured it out. And then I was able to, through a number of ways, that actually we didn't even know each other at this point. Ben wasn't involved in this. I got the footage. And so what the footage showed was that in January of 2016, the police had followed a guy. When he came the other way, they stopped, he stopped, and within moments they're shooting at him. This was recorded at the time. It was known. The shooting itself was on the news. And so, it kind of got quickly cleared, like a lot of police shooting done, it moved on. But the bottom line of what I'm trying to stress here is that there was an example of this. And in fact, I think it would be arguably the most successful case.
Yeah.
Jawan Richards, who was shot by police, did eventually get out of jail. He got an $850,000 settlement from the city. That's something. I'm not saying that justifies being shot in the face by cops, but something happened. So in terms of this, but then you look at this, well, what really happened? We're talking about the plane working. The plane working in this case is that in 2016 it captured a police shooting, that everyone involved with the plane ignored it, pretended it didn't exist until, even though Ross is also boasting of it behind the scenes, I figured it out. By that point, it didn't matter. They dropped the charge. It didn't matter to them anymore. The plane was not in the air anymore. They dropped his charges eventually. Jawan did 3 years in prison because he had a gun or something like that. And then he got a settlement. That's not the plane working. That's not technology working. That's the opposite. But those are kind of the most generous stories of this. And that kind of relates to, I think, the kind of second to last thing we'll do before we get to questions, which would be, Do you want to talk about the Fourth Amendment violations of this? Yeah, it's kind of central to the concerns about this, obviously, yeah.
Yeah, so the spy plane, as many of you will know, is considered unlawful now because of a Fourth Amendment decision from the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers Maryland and Virginia and several other states. So the way that lawsuit came about is the ACLU teamed up with Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, Erica Bridgeford, and some other activists in the city, and they sued the Baltimore Police Department saying that the spy plane is unconstitutional. It violates our Fourth Amendment rights. And so that litigation went on all during the time that the spy plane was up and capturing footage and doing its work, and there was appeal after appeal. And by the time the program was shuttered already, actually, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals heard the case a second time and overturned a previous ruling and said that the plane is unconstitutional. So the reasoning behind that is actually really fascinating. It's based on a pretty key Supreme Court case that happened in 2018 called Carpenter versus United States. So if you want to go down a rabbit hole, you should check this out. The Carpenter decision has completely upended Fourth Amendment law, but essentially what the Supreme Court justices of the United States have said is that we have a right to privacy in the quote unquote whole of our movements. So that means if a police officer or any agent of the state looks at us or takes a measurement of us or has a sensor track us once, that's kind of fine if it's done in a constitutional way. But if they do that again and again and again and again and again for hours or days, that's unconstitutional. So the argument that the justices have made is that because there's so many technologies that can track us for extremely long periods of time, we ought to have a protection about that specific scenario. And so what happened is the spy plane, you can think about those photographs as a kind of police search. Every single time that shutter goes click, the police are kind of searching you in a way. And what the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals argued is that the spy plane flies straight into the terrain of the Carpenter decision, and it is violating our privacy. So what happened with that decision is that it happened quite late in the game. So there were many cases sitting in court being prosecuted, and the state's attorney's office looked at those cases and said, they are all now corrupted because of the spy plane. If spy plane evidence was in the casework, that corrupts the case. So the argument would be that, for example, if the spy plane pointed detectives to CCTV camera footage that they wouldn't have been able to find otherwise, that means they got to that CCTV footage through an unconstitutional route. But they actually went even further than that. They said, even if the spy plane was used and wasn't useful to the case, it also corrupts the case. Because any defense attorney worth their salt is going to say, wait, you photographed my client with a spy plane? No, that's not happening. And the case would have been thrown out. So they more or less preemptively threw out every single case except one, which Brandon and I wrote about. And that meant that even cases that were successful, like the one that I read to you about, ultimately got thrown out of court. And so what I found is that the suspects in those cases waited in jail for 2 years, some of them, waiting for something to happen. They lost their jobs. They, of course, put incredible pressure on their families because of that. One guy got COVID in jail while this was happening when he could have been released earlier. And, you know, on the side of the victims, the families never get justice in those cases. One case that I looked at, they released the suspect back into the victim's family's neighborhood. And so that person would have been seen in their neighborhood. And they, as far as I can tell, what detectives told me is that they definitely had the right guy. And we just can't prosecute this because of the spy plane. So that was a huge trauma for that family. They will probably potentially take the law into their own hands. I could see that happening very, very much from that incident. So again, that's a concrete harm that we should have debated before the plane was launched. Is there going to be a Fourth Amendment trial with this thing? Is it going to actually stand up in court? Those are things we should have been debating, but instead we were debating, Is the plane going to watch me in my bikini in my backyard? Right?
And sort of the last question we're going to questions from the audience would be, for me, is one thing I think is kind of powerful about this story is that leaders of a beautiful struggle, Erica Bridgeford, son of none, and a number of other people in this community that really care, basically ended this thing. That's remarkable. And it makes me think a little bit of the last election, where at least locally, there was some, these Sinclair-style ballots got rejected. Like, there's a certain community engagement here that's very strong that worked. And so I guess the question is, like, this technology is not going away. There's definitely stuff better than this that already is flying around in other places. So what do you say could be done or should be done to sort of resist this, or at least like create some kind of accountability about it before someone is jacked up for something they didn't do because someone jumped a pixel?
Yeah, well, so, in addition to, I think, just having a healthier discourse about technology that actually gets us to debate the most important issues, I actually think we in Baltimore, I'll put myself in the we because I love this city that much. I think we in Baltimore need to have more community control over police surveillance technology, and we need to find a way to do that. So there's a couple of different routes that I've seen in other places. One is the kind of regulatory route. So we could have a civilian oversight board, for example. Those types of things are being tried. There's legislation currently at City Council that I think has not been well received by the police, but is being debated now. I'm meeting with a couple of those folks next week to talk to them about that bill to see, what the viability is. I don't think that's a solution, but I think it's a step in the right direction. If we can have a civilian oversight board that can ask these types of questions when a new technology comes in, what are its harms? Does it actually work? Is it going to hold up in court? Et cetera, et cetera. They should be able to ask those questions and get concrete answers. If the answers aren't forthcoming, that for-profit technology company needs to go away. If they can't answer that, go away, is what I would say. But I think for a lot of people, especially if you live around a lot of violence, that's not actually helping you. You want a solution to the crime now. And technology might actually be able to help with that in certain cases. And so I would love us to think more about how we can have community engagement at the stage of asking for technology. We want something for our neighborhood. Can you come help us? Instead of police just deploying stuff on us without us asking, we should have input at the level of deployment. How is this thing going to be rolled out, and what should be the guide rails and guardrails for the technology? And we should have some community input on whether or not the thing worked. Did it actually do what it said it was going to do? Did it hold up in court or not? And we should get answers to those things. If it created harms that weren't anticipated, we should find out about that, and somebody needs to be held accountable. The fact that the spy plane resulted in false positives should be scandalous. And we should be like, does that happen with other stuff that we have? It does. It happens with ShotSpotter all the time. It happens with facial recognition stuff all the time. And we ought to know when it happens, how often it happens, who it's happening to. And there should be a community oversight group that allows us to really get answers to those questions, right? So I would love us to start pushing for that. And if people are game, I'm in. Let's do it.
Yeah, and in contrast, what we often get is maybe someone like me or you figures something out, or almost often stumbles upon something, or we find it out when the Board of Estimates agenda shows up, or maybe you get Bill Henry's emails where they're in there, and you find out about it after, right before it's being voted on. So I think that's really important to mention, is there is these concrete harms, and then there are just the sort of concerns about ShotSpotter is sort of the strongest one, I think, in this case, because it so clearly doesn't work. And it has such a, I can speak for someone who's covered it, and they're very litigious as well. If you get anything wrong in a story, they have a communications person that will send it to you, and they will scare the shit out of you. And, and it's easy for a company like that to really scare an editor, and a story gets changed, or some sort of PR line gets reinserted into it, and things like that. We started a little late, so I don't know how much time we have for questions, but does anyone have any questions? I'll bring the mic. How about I start? We'll do, okay.
Lots of questions.
I sort of saw where that. Oh, you know, I'm playing. You can do this.
That's that good community anarchist action right there. Just take it. Just take it.
That's what I'm talking about.
I will bring the mic around. We do have plenty to mine in this rich conversation. We don't have all the hours in the night to do it. So we want to keep our comments and questions relatively brief and truncated so that we can get a few in. And yes, if you all can help me see whose hands were up. And I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that's going to be it. All right, because we're up against time. And again, we want to be very brief in our questions and responses. The first hand over here was.
Hi. Could you speak briefly on the funding streams behind this and just like how that worked and also maybe how much it cost to operate this boondoggle?
Yeah. So the exact cost we don't know, in part because there was some administrative costs that weren't factored into the sticker price. So there were various forms of liaisoning between police and PSS that I don't think were really factored in. So in terms of man hours and stuff, we don't really know. The exact price, I can't remember the exact number, but it costs a heck of a lot less than police helicopters and stuff like that. I think Ross would often pitch it this way, that how much do you spend, in fuel on a police helicopter? Our program is cheaper than just that. So it's actually pretty cheap to run, in part because they paid the analysts so poorly, too, I should say. But the funding stream came through a funny mechanism, which is the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. So Laura and John Arnold are billionaires who live in Texas, and John Arnold in particular has a venture fund, and he puts his money behind a lot of police experiments around technology. So he heard the same podcast I did the same thing I did, which is called up Ross McNutt and said, hey, if you can find a place that will fly the plane, I'll fund it. And so he footed the bill. And that included other institutions that were around to do audits and write reports and do surveys and stuff like that. So he paid for a lot of that stuff. So it was free to the city in that way.
Hey, thanks so much for being here and talking about this. So I really appreciate the emphasis on specific harms. And it seems like with this, one of the specific harms is just the amount of resources that went into it. And in focusing on specific harms rather than the boomer and the doomer cycle, do you have thoughts around how to avoid falling into the trap of specific harms lending themselves to more specific solutions? So for example, you could imagine lots and lots of resources going into automating the analyst's job towards making the resolution higher. And with each of these kinds of issues around false positives that are put forth, that's sort of another opportunity for the police to really increase their capacity for surveillance and ultimately put more resources and more power in their hands in trying to sort of address the specific issues. And so, I wonder if you could talk about avoiding that trap of more resources ending up giving them more power, as it were.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a great question. I mean, I wondered to myself, well, if I don't want to say boomer doomer stuff, then what do I want people to say? And the language that I arrived at was the language around experimentation. I really think it's an effective political line to say, we don't want police experimenting on us. And by experiment, I mean playing around with shit that we don't even know works. So mad scientist experimentation, not true, randomly controlled trial experimentation. So I sort of think politically, and actually I think Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle did this really well. Actually, they said you don't actually know if the thing works. I don't want you experimenting on us. Until you understand what it is you have, I don't think you should be allowed to deploy it. So that is not pie in the sky doomerism. It's really quite concrete. It's tell me exactly what it can do. And until you can tell me that, and tell me exactly what its harms are, and until you can tell me that, I don't really feel comfortable with you just deploying this thing on me willy-nilly. Or if you're gonna do it, then can we talk about some guardrails? So I think the language of experimentation might be a kind of political line we could push that doesn't end up falling into the doomer trap. And one thing I'll note about the doomer trap is that it's really easy to push back on by boomers. They can just be like, you're dreaming. Like, you think that dystopia is gonna happen, and I just don't. I think it's gonna be great. Do you know? So it's sort of like, where do we go in this debate? And so I think experimentation might cut through in a way.
Hello.
Hi.
I actually accidentally got exposed to this in late 2019 because the University of Baltimore Law School, Ivan Bates,
Yeah.
who had the case, the one successful case against the GTTF, that was being exposed in there
Yeah.
before the planes went back up.
Yeah.
So before they had those bogus community meetings or whatever, I actually saw this.
Yeah.
And that's what raised my concerns with it.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if I was supposed to be there. I don't know if like regular non-law students were supposed to be there.
I think it was the Baltimore Legal Hackers event, which
Yeah,
was shout out Baltimore
yeah.
Legal Hackers.
Yeah.
That was a public event, but it was very
it was incredible.
And Brandon was
so
there, yeah.
that is what got me on board about being against it.
Yeah.
And then I went to every one of the community meetings because I wanted to see how they were selling it to people.
Yeah.
And then I was talking to citizens afterwards, like especially over in West Baltimore. I was like, look, I've seen this thing in action and this is dangerous.
Yeah.
You know, and then I don't really have a question. I just wanted to make some comments.
so glad you said that, yeah.
So then I actually wound up on this activist kind of email thing with Mary Pat Clark.
Yep.
She was staunchly against it.
Yep.
And a whole bunch of like professors from Hopkins or whatever, like I was part of that whole email thing. And then Delegate Grammer from Baltimore County, who's a Republican, actually put forth legislation so that this couldn't happen anywhere in Maryland, not just Baltimore.
Yeah.
Because it was such a bad idea. And what I would go and argue when I was going to those community meetings, because they were actually screening the questions before they were being asked. So I wrote a question that I knew would pass the screening, and then when it was my turn for the mic, I actually said what I wanted to say.
Good on you.
But my whole thing was, say I'm on Pennsylvania Avenue in my car, and you know, there's like a car next to me, and I'm at a light, and then all of a sudden a shooting happens, and I want to get the hell out of there.
Yeah.
And I zoom off, but so does the person who jumps in their car.
Yep.
And they follow me home
They would.
and send the cops, like you were saying. Like,
Yeah.
thank God they got called off on that case, because we know Baltimore City Police like going and shooting and asking questions later. So
Yeah.
that's what I would bring up at these community meetings. And finally, like, they wouldn't even call my name.
Yeah, and thank you so much. And think about it, like in that scenario, if you had known ahead of time that you could be tracked and a mistake could be made because your car was next to the car that was the suspect, you would have a different attitude about the whole program. You would be like, no, this is freaking me out. Heck no. Like, do you know that you won't skip cars? And they would have to say, no, like we try not to, and usually we don't, but sometimes we do. Yeah.
There you go. T.
Thanks. I'm so bummed to learn that every time the plane flew over and I gave it the finger, it didn't actually show up on the video.
So sorry.
My question is, you mentioned Ciudad Juarez as one place where this had been used before, and I wonder if you could speak a bit more about the military genealogy, the overseas and military genealogy of this technology, because it strikes me that it was found to violate the Fourth Amendment. Well, the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply in Iraq, so that might be one reason why the boosterism behind it didn't really consider whether the Constitution mattered. So I wonder if you could just speak about how this technology came into existence and what effect the kind of testing of it in theaters of war has on its use domestically.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. The origins of the spy plane are in the Iraq War. And so McNutt was in the military before he became a technologist, private technologist. And one of the things that he helped the military do is track roadside bombers in the Iraq War. So the spy plane's original purpose was to witness an explosion and then rewind the tape and see if we can find who planted that bomb. And we could track them back hours and hours, days and days, find their place of operations, and then kill them. So that's what he originally designed the plane to do. And then after he retired, he thought, maybe police could use this too, and found a way to try to work it into domestic policing. But as you said, the realm of war and the realm of policing are radically different realms with radically different rules, especially around privacy, right? So, but what you will notice with this technology, as well as ShotSpotter, facial recognition, all of this stuff, is that almost all of it originates in some of our wars abroad. And it might be our wars, the United States, but it might be other people's wars too. The Israeli state in particular creates lots and lots of gadgets that eventually will find their homes here in Baltimore. So one of the things that I think we should all be looking for is what the current conflict in Gaza is going to produce. We already know about a few like AI targeting systems and things like that that are being used. And we ought to be on the lookout for that stuff coming here eventually. I can almost guarantee you within a few years, 10 years, it's going to come here in some form. So don't forget that I said that. And when it comes, we should ask all the questions that I'm asking you to ask about the spy plane. So does AI targeting actually work? I don't think it actually does. I think what it does is creates a lot of targets, imprecise targets, and then sends the state after those targets. That is not something I want the Baltimore Police Department to be doing. So again, we should avoid the dystopian view that an AI targeting system can like see all the targets perfectly and accurately. It probably can't. And we should really be asking the concrete question about what does it really do? So it's really important that we pay attention to that international dimension and show how that imperial boomerang, as we call it in the field, can come back from the US to an international theater of war, back to the US. We have to pay attention to that circuit.
I think we had two more hands.
Thank you. I wanted to ask actually both of you to talk about the kind of bigger picture question of these private technologies, sort of private contracting vis-a-vis municipal police like the Baltimore Police Department, right? So the spy plane is a kind of particularly egregious example, but it's a weird one because the Arnolds paid for it, right? And that was and so I wonder, like, how much money are we spending on these kinds of, we already know that the BPD has an exorbitant, massive budget that goes up over and over, right? But how much money are we spending in a way that is also similar to the kind of overseas theater question, which is how much money is actually going to these private contractors, to these philanthropies that are quote unquote reformers, in that way that's, again, going back to the question of sort of constantly expanding the resources. And now we have the resources that are actually going to these private firms, right, rather than even just more sort of like cops on the beat.
Go for it.
So Ben will do this better than I do. But one thing I would say related to that specifically is, like, really briefly, so when it was funded in 2016, it was funded by the Arnolds, and they got the money of the police. They can't give the police money, so they had to find a nonprofit or a 501c3 to do it, to be the pass-through. And that turned out to be the Baltimore Community Foundation, which I bring up because it's complex, because it's not like, and like I've done stories for publications where I've had to disclose that the Arnolds gave that place money and often, like, one story I did was about COVID in jail, and they had, in my opinion, a very strong and useful COVID in jail sort of projection thing that you could use. It was very helpful for my reporting. But I know the Arnolds first and foremost from the plane. I bring that up to say that, like, even a small thing like that, if I can get sort of in my nonprofit brain, is like, okay, so if it's X million, they're a pass-through. Like, where does that money end up within the foundation that takes it, the pass-through of it? The money gets distributed. We see this all the time. So, like, even on a really, really micro level, a lot of money is distributed, and where that goes and how that. And then the other side of it is that the amount of money that private and public, when it comes to something like this, goes towards making it so that people like me or all of us in this room who care can't figure any of it out is very important. And I don't know the exact number of that, but that's a really central part. Like, ShotSpotter is my kind of favorite example because it's so bad, right?
And
but
expensive.
Also,
and expensive.
And expensive. And also, it doesn't work. So there's like these, like, just like these concentric, just like this, I always describe the police department as these concentric circles of corruption, just because concentric circles of spending and waste while we're being experimented on. And so I think it's just important to think about all these ways that it reaches out. And then all the work also, I mean, like, you know, the NYPD is in the news for an interesting reason this week, but like, you know, with the NYPD, we know how large their press people are, their comms, which are just propagandists. What is an example like that? How much time is spent? I'm not saying I'm important, but like, how much time is spent just making sure some annoying asshole like me doesn't get what I'm getting to? What will they spend? What will they do? So that's just a weird element of it that I've seen in ShotSpotter. They've told, when I used to look for ShotSpotter, try to figure out where it was, they tell you that they don't have to disclose that. And then you figured it out because of a weird way, which is a good segue to you answering the question.
Yeah, all the ShotSpotter locations were leaked by a disgruntled employee. So you can go to the fabulous Wired magazine and get them. And pretty soon, the Baltimore Banner, I've been working with a little bit, and we're gonna have a surveillance map that has the locations of every single surveillance sensor that we have information about that you can look at and interact with. And we might have some spy plane stuff on there. I don't know if they're gonna do that. But just like to add one last thing to that, which is in part of the book, I tell you the history of modern surveillance technology in Baltimore, and from the late 90s to the 2010s. And this is this really critical moment when the surveillance infrastructure just explodes in the city. And I try to tell you the exact dollar amount of every single gadget that I looked at, and it's hundreds of millions of dollars that could be going to, name the thing, the school, the public school. Yeah.
Hi. So just a couple of quick things. The first thing you mentioned, the linkage to Israel. Every blue light camera in the city is, in fact, it's an Israeli research company that is based in New Jersey. The second thing is, so I had the unfortunate experience of having to listen to Ross McNutt talk at a work function because of poor choices that I have made. And I wanted to, you mentioned the analysts. I remember distinctly hearing Ross McNutt, well, do something appropriate to his last name, over the use of local youth as his analysts to try to pretend that he was anchored in the community. Could you tell me more about the analysts and how you, like, you know, who they were and how you talked to them and how they even got roped into working with PSS?
I'm so glad you brought that up. There's a whole chapter in the book about this, so you can get like deep into the weeds with it. But the short answer is Ross promised in part of the lead up to the program and all those community meetings that I told you about that he would invest in West Baltimore in particular by creating jobs. So he would create analyst jobs that he said would be a pathway to jobs in like Department of Justice and the NSA and stuff like that. So you could get this kind of first experience in a tech job, and then that would eventually lead to this career. And he said, we're gonna hire people from the community. They're gonna be young people who don't really have many pathways into a good job like this. And what ended up happening is that that was half true. They hired half of the team were from West Baltimore, all black, all young. The other half of the team were from an Orthodox Jewish community in North Baltimore, and almost all women, actually. And they got to them through like a computer course. Lots of these women were taking computer courses like learning PowerPoint and things like that, and they sort of said, hey, they might have a lot of people who would want this job. And so they sort of put these two groups together very awkwardly in the Spy Plane Operations Center. But folks in West Baltimore who were promised jobs, some of them didn't get those jobs. And they didn't get them because the Jewish women got the jobs. So there were a lot of hard feelings about that too. But the way that came about then was through a kind of promise that you could get a personal investment in the spy plane program. And so I want to be clear, those black analysts really did like the job and found a lot of value in it, actually. And some of them cried when the program was shut down. They were like, this was an incredible opportunity for me to help my neighborhood. And many of them tracked cases right above their own houses. And they would use their kind of like genius level knowledge of the street to be better trackers. It was actually good for the company in many ways. They could tell you what a particular street really looked like when you're walking down it, as opposed to this grainy stuff, you know? So that's the story of that. And if you want to know more about like what happened to those analysts and what it was like for them to work, it's in the book.
I'm in and say that one of the things that's really great about Ben's book is that you get to see these people as characters, which sort of at least temporarily like allows you to extract them as from the work they do, like this is a job, and that's interesting. And I think another thing that's like a totally unforeseen element of this that I never thought about was, and this is in the book too, Ben, so I'll have you talk about this for a second, is like some people were afraid to take the job because it sort of recreated the concerns about snitching, which we could unpack for an hour and are slightly overstated, but that's a different. But that the central concern about where does violence come and how is violence created? Well, the plane disrupts a community by recording it from above, and also by, weirdly enough, like injecting a certain amount of like weird funny money into the community that might move people to work for it, which we all need to work, but then also creates this tension in these communities where like you're an analyst on that thing that's catching, it creates and there's no way that was talked about or discussed by I don't imagine anyone was thinking about that complexity. They weren't talking to like safe streets and violence interrupters who understand that complexity, I don't imagine.
Right. Yeah, we probably have to end, right? This will be the last thing. So it's worse than that, actually. So when the analysts first arrived, they were told by Ross McNutt that they wouldn't have to testify. So if they worked on a case, they were told that they could remain relatively anonymous and that the only person who would be a face in court would be Ross McNutt. He would testify to the validity of the tracking and all that. Well, that wasn't true. And they found out that no, just like any kind of like forensic professional, if you use the tool, you have to testify to the work. And so these analysts were suddenly told, like, yeah, if this goes to trial, you're going to have to come to court. You're going to have to stand up there and say, yes, I work for the spy plane, and here's what I did. And the black analysts, not the white ones, were terrified. They thought, I could get killed over this. Like, people don't know. Like, I don't tell even my family that I work here. So, like, I've been laying low this whole time, and now you're telling me I have to go in front of a courtroom? Like, I'm not doing that. So a couple of them actually left after they found out about that. Those who did stay on did a lot of things to conceal their identity. When they left the Spy Plane Operations Center, they would take off their work outfit. They had these, like, PSS shirts. They would take those shirts off before they got on the bus because they were afraid people would identify them. So, like, there were real risks for those employees, and they were not made clear to them when they were hired.
Wow, we actually had to draw to a close. You'll have an opportunity to meet our authors in a second. Brandon, you already know, anytime you want to come and drop knowledge, you are always welcome. Benjamin, thank you for this, because this is some intricate work on a crucial subject. And this took a lot to even put together. Thank you so much for the audio visual. It's fascinating shit that we need to be right on top of and continue to organize on. So we really appreciate your coming. One more big Radical Red Emmys round of applause for Brandon Soderbergh and Benjamin.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'll see you all.